Hello, I'm Dan Proskauer. I live at 240 Derby Street. I have two children in Franklin School and one at Day Middle School. So first, I wanted to recognize the challenge and hard work that goes into creating a budget for something as complex as the Newton Public Schools. It's really a significant effort, and one which unfortunately probably yields very little in the way of reward and fulfillment. But my immediate reaction to the budget proposal was that it's more of the same. And I wanted to explain what I mean by that. The budget is presented in comparison to prior year's budgets. So each section describes the change from prior year and justifies why there's been an increase or a decrease in that area. And that approach, while it's easy to follow, does not in any fundamental way solve the structural financial problem that we're all facing in the schools. I think this budget misses an opportunity to do one or more things differently. The first opportunity is to throw out last year's budget and start from scratch, using a top-down, priority-based budgeting approach. In this method, you establish the amount of money that you have available, in this case dictated by the mayor, and then and you establish the priorities of what you want to achieve, in this case outlined by the school committee. From there, you examine how much money you're willing to allocate to each priority and continue until you run out of money to allocate. This is obviously an iterative process, because once the list of what falls off the table is known, the priorities may be and probably will be revised. Even if this approach by itself does not drive the budget to completion, it can lead to surprising conclusions that otherwise you would never see. The second item that I was surprised to see omitted from the budget proposal was explicit discussion of the upcoming contract negotiations. I had personally read through nearly the entire budget document before I saw in the news and in the press that the budget proposal called for wage freezes in the contract. I quickly went back to the document and searched for contract freeze and COLA and didn't find anything relevant. Why were the assumptions used in the budget not explicitly stated in the document? Why weren't the potential budgetary impacts of varying contract scenarios not explicitly described? I remember the passionate and vivid comparisons made in both the text and the tables of the override budget compared to the allocation budget last year. Why the reticence to be equally explicit now? The final point that I want to make is the opportunity to demonstrate data-driven decision-making. This is something that the school committee has been requesting for some time, and as such, I think would be a priority within the budget. So I'm going to use the same example that we just heard about, which is the math coaches. And in this case, in the budget document, it came enticingly close to using data. The 2008 MCAS test results were cited, as was some industry research. However, the description of the pilot program didn't describe the change in the MCAS scores at the piloted schools compared to the change in the schools that were not part of the pilot. This seems like an obvious way to measure the success of the program. Instead, the proposal describes experience to date indicates that the presence of a coach has a powerful effect on teachers' willingness to make improving their mathematics instruction a priority. Conversely, schools without math coaches have had a much more difficult time improving mathematics teaching and learning. In general, the budget document is missing the same section for every item. After what is the need and what is the expected outcome of the proposal should be how will the effectiveness of this be measured. Only then does what does the cost make sense. Thank you.
Kurt, did you want to respond?
Yeah, I want to respond and then ask a question because this is interesting. With respect to why specifics regarding the negotiations with the teachers isn't covered is because when you're in a negotiation like that, you generally don't broadcast your positions only because you don't want the other side obviously to know necessarily those positions any more than they want you to know their starting positions. But my question for you was, I'm interested in your approach at looking at the budget, going from the top down and categorizing from most important to least important and using the money until you run out, essentially. Given your review of the budget, what program or programs would you cut?
You can't start that way, or you're doing kind of the same thing of starting from what you have and cutting. You need to start by looking at what are the priorities that we have as a school system, and we have a long list. Right, and the school committee has...
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, maybe I misspoke. I didn't mean to actually say start from the bottom, go up, but I'm assuming you've sort of done that in your own head, going and starting with your own priorities, and I'm interested, as a community member, what would you think are the least important programs that are in the budget now, such that you would consider cutting them?
Well, It's an interesting question, and obviously that's where the rub, right? That's where the rubber meets the road all the time. So what do you cut? I think that you need to start looking at all of the things that are on the table and where the big cost drivers are. And you need to look at what are the key elements. So I think we've had a ton of discussion about class sizes. I think class sizes are something that, is obviously problematic to some people, but I think class sizes is something we would have to look at very carefully. It's something that was described in this proposal as, we have to give somewhere and that's what we're giving. That might be a place that we have to give. I think, the problem with asking the question of what do you cut is that if you don't start from the place of what do we want to get out of the school system and what are the key priorities, then you really are, starting back the way it was of what do we have and what do we take away. If you start from the other direction, you may end up somewhere that you didn't expect to, and we haven't gone through that process, I think, either as the school committee or the superintendent or the citizens. And it's a process, and you really have to do it to see where it leads. So I think trying to jump to the end of that process and say where we end up is shortchanging.
Well, we actually have done that process, but I was just trying to get a sense of where the community was and where you might be, as a person who's obviously very interested and has gone through the budget, but it's all right.
Well, I think there's a comment there, and that is that this is one gentleman, and he doesn't have the staff.
Oh, I understand.
But the process is, I think it's an important point to make.
Well, I'm going to just remind everyone, this is precisely what Kurt's alluding to, is what I've been asking my colleagues, and I'm going to ask the community to do, which is budgets are all about trade-offs. And if people have suggestions about how we can do things differently, we need to hear them. But we have a finite amount of money, and we need to hear, if you think we ought to take it from someplace, or do something different, add someplace, where should we take it from? And that's the real challenge. That's the hard part, as far as I'm concerned, of this job, is making those trade-offs, and very difficult trade-offs. But that's what we're hired to do. Yes, Susie.
Dan, one of the things that I think may be surprising is, and I'm sure that the staff in the schools have done it, there are certain things that you have no choice about. We have 21 buildings and they need to be somewhat warm and somewhat light. I think when you
Less warm and more light is my choice, Susie.
When you start laying out the things that we have to do, because we have to do them, like, heat and light the buildings, and then you start laying out the mandated things, I think that what is discretionary is smaller than any of us would like it to be.
Sure, and I recognize that, at least to a certain extent, and I'll explain what I mean by that. If you start from a position of handcuffed, right, handcuffed by, obviously have to light the buildings, handcuffed by the contracts, handcuffed by the mandates of various things, then, you start with the last 15% that you're playing with, and there's very little you can do. And again, I haven't been through this journey with all of you, and I'm sure it's been a painful one, but if you can just, even for an intellectual exercise, take all of that away and say, we don't have any of that. It's all negotiable, even if it may not be, and see what you would come out with, starting from a completely blank sheet of paper. What's important to us? Elementary school education is important. We want to have XYZ class sizes. We're going to need this many teachers, this many aides. Okay, we put that in a box. Middle schools, we want to have this kind of team size. We want to do these things. Put that in a box, right? And you keep working through, and eventually you run out of money, and you start looking at what you haven't gotten to yet. Maybe you haven't gotten to any long-term building maintenance. It's obviously a problem. You're not going to get away with no maintenance. We've been trying to do minimal maintenance for quite some time, right? So, and you go through that iteration, but you don't start with what you had last year. At the end of it, you look and you compare to where you ended up to what you had.
You see, I saw a lot of
Susie,
changes in this budget.
I'm going to interject here. We could. I'm going to hold all comments. Okay. I think it's 8 o'clock. I think it's really important to move on to our regular discussions. So, thank you very much. No more comments. Student representatives, Ben, do you have anything to report to us tonight?
I do. So I'm